Hello YouTube. I decided to make this a scripted video as I feel it needs the care of being properly written. That means you don't get to see my glorious face, which I'm sure is upsetting you all right now. But it does mean I can illustrate my points with pictures, which I'll try to do. So, here goes. What does left wing even mean? The terms right wing and left wing are thrown around all the time online, and they're often confusing. Given that this channel has become quite political as of late, and honestly always was really, I thought I'd take the time to explain what I mean when I say left wing and right wing, as well as defining a few other political terms, so they can be used properly and effectively. So often arguments are had simply because people don't realise that they're talking about different things, but using the same term. I'm going to try to do this by staying as neutral as possible, but I'll probably fail. Still, I want to try to be fair in depicting both sides here, so here we go. Part 1. History of the terms. So, the history of the term left wing and right wing, as I understand them, are rooted in UK politics, specifically the way the House of Commons was originally structured. The King had his advisers and supporters sitting to his right, hence right wing, and they tended to support the needs of the Lords and the monarchy, whilst the commoners sat to his left and represented the needs of the everyday everyman. At least, they supposedly did. This is why we have the broad idea that right wing is on the side of the rich and left wing is on the side of the poor, often seen as the side of the workers. It's a good place to start, at least. So the right wing is concerned with keeping the Lords happy, right? The modern equivalent to that would be keeping the rich and influential people happy, I would imagine. Which usually means lower taxes, high immigration, because that means cheap labour, both for them hiring maids, gardeners, etc., and workers for the businesses that they own, and very little government oversight or spending. The rich don't really need the government to do things for them, so would rather the government stays out of everything except those things that the individual struggles to do regardless of money, such as creating agreeable laws, building a base infrastructure, and running the armed forces. Conversely, the left wing is concerned with keeping the commoner happy. The modern equivalent to that would be keeping the average worker happy. This usually means higher spending on public services which the average person will use, such as the police, healthcare, transit, energy, etc. Protecting the average worker from being exploited by passing regulations on the job market, food standards, etc. And keeping immigration low so that the workers don't have to compete for services and jobs with foreigners, which will put a strain on those services and lower the wages and bargaining position of the workers. So far, these natural lines make sense, but they collapse very quickly when you realise that we're only talking about one axis. This is fiscal politics, and it looks nothing like modern politics. I've not used the words privilege or race once yet. That's what politics is nowadays, isn't it? Sadly, yes it is. So far, all we've discussed is the difference between collectivism and individualism, and both have their arguments. While it started out being just fiscal, the mentality becomes the basis for other ways of thinking too. Collectivists want high democracy and more centralised control, more globalism, but with plenty of say, every voice counted and everyone working together. Individualists, however, want decentralised government with state powers preferred over federal powers and city powers preferred over state powers. They prefer for outsiders to mind their own business and for each to do as they want to do and keep to themselves. They resent others being allowed to vote on how they should live their lives and tend to be anti-democratic in some ways. Part 2. The other axis. The other political axis, whenever you look at a political compass, is usually referred to as the authoritarian versus libertarian axis. And it doesn't tend to have a direction associated. No one describes a libertarian as bottom wing or an authoritarian as top wing, but it would make about as much sense. However, both extreme libertarians and extreme authoritarians are regularly called far-right or alt-right. This is largely because the term right-wing was for a long time used by many biased media sources as a direct insult. Therefore, if you're an extreme form of this insult, you're even worse. Being a bit right-wing was acceptable, but being far-right was shameful. Thus, every extreme lunatic was now far right. The most famous example of this would be the Nazis, who are pretty much always referred to as far right on every document you'll see, including even the likes of Wikipedia, despite them being openly and avowedly left-wing. This is the point where offended Democrats, Socialists, Liberals and other lefties switch the video off in disgust because they can't be asked to listen and refuse to accept that the Nazis were ever left-wing, even though I've already explained that left-wing is a fiscal term and it absolutely does fit with the National Socialist Party, who believed in the principles to such a degree that it makes up half of their goddamn name. These people will never listen, so good riddance to them. As for the rest of you, thanks for sticking around. Yes, extremists exist on all sides of the spectrum, and Nazis are left-wing authoritarians. They're also evil, murderous fuckheads, but we already knew that. They're about the same level of left-wing, though, as both Gandhi and Bernie Sanders, so given that, we should probably figure out what this axis actually means, because it's clearly very important. So what exactly is authoritarian versus libertarian then? The hint is in the name. Authoritarians believe that authority is a profoundly good thing, that the government should make the laws and enforce the laws, and that people should do as they're told. Depending on how you fall in other areas, usually decides how you feel about how the government should be formed. And this is where the Nazis seem to differ in their position on the political compass. The Nazis believed the government should run the hospitals, schools, trains, energy sector and much more. They wanted to rise up the common worker, so long as they were an Aryan, obviously, but let's ignore the racism issue for just a minute. And they didn't allow for extreme wealth. So this is clearly very left-wing. This is collectivism. They also believed in heavy centralisation, which is also a very collectivist ideal. Ergo, left. Collectivism should result in a high amount of democracy, but in this case it doesn't. They did have democracy. The Nazis were originally elected into office. But there's an interesting point in authoritarianism where the deferring to authority becomes so intense and so ingrained that the mere act of voting against your own government is seen as a wrongful act by that ideology and is punished. This means that whilst collectivist and centralised, often socialist in its running, the government becomes extremely individualist at its upper levels, and you end up with fascism. A small group of self-appointed individuals ruling over everyone else with extreme and absolute authority. Almost every example of left-wing authoritarianism becomes fascism. Every attempt at communism or socialism in history has done this so far. That doesn't make them right-wing, that makes them heavily authoritarian. So what about libertarian? Well, they believe that liberty is a profoundly good thing. This means all forms of personal freedom, including but not limited to free speech, free association, freedom of religion, and the right to own, do and say and think whatever you want. So the right to own guns, the right to use drugs, the right to have sex with whoever you want, whenever and however you want, these are all libertarian values. Again, you take libertarian values to an extreme and you end up with a ridiculous Mad Max style anarchic and lawless world. After all, the whole point of libertarianism is that you don't recognise someone else's authority over you. The only authority you recognise is your own. They can't tell you what to do, who to love, how to think, but at an extreme, that means you don't accept the rule of law, and would consider someone telling you not to murder someone else as being them taking away your right to kill. It sounds extreme and stupid, but fundamentally, that is what's happening with this ideology. So, the extremes on both sides are cartoonishly evil. Part 3. Aren't they really just left and right wing again? Well, yes they are. If you really think about it carefully, this isn't actually a new axis at all. People think it is, people treat it as a new axis. You'll see this compass test all over the internet, but it's really just a different framing of the same axis. Collectivism and individualism. An authoritarian believes everyone should follow the rules of society and that those rules should be enforced. They support the use of force by the state and believe that the majority opinion is always the correct opinion. Therefore, they're collectivist. A libertarian believes that no one has the right to control them, that themselves and only themselves are able to decide their fate. That the only laws they follow are the ones they choose to follow through contracts and agreements that they decide on independently with each other on a one-to-one basis. So this is individualism to an extreme degree. So if this is the case, why are there such divides? Certain opinions should be clearly one way or another. If collectivism is left-wing and individualism is right-wing, how can we have situations that make no sense? Let's use, for example, abortion. Yes, hot-button issue, I know, but it's a really good example. So, surely the right to choose what to do with your body is a fundamentally right-wing belief, because it's a civil liberty. Therefore, we should see the right campaigning for pro-abortion policies, but we actually see the opposite, don't we? The right generally sees abortion as not a right for the pregnant person to have, but a violation of the right to the life of the baby. After all, every one of us is pro-life and pro-choice. What decides this issue is at what stage you consider the fetus to be a person, and whether you believe the rights of the unborn baby trump the rights of the pregnant woman. Which one takes precedence? The argument can be convincingly made both ways, and it's very easy to see why the opposite side would be furious with the opposing argument. If you believe the fetus is a baby, you believe that abortion advocates are literally murdering babies. These people are baby murderers and they have the gall to act like they're on the moral high ground. Of course you hate them. But if you believe that the fetus is nothing more than a ball of cells, you see this reaction as an extreme and laughable overreaction. These anti-abortion types are forcing women to have babies they don't want, completely ruining their lives and forcing them into financial ruin and a constant stressful responsibility that they didn't want because you won't allow them a simple medical procedure. They're making demands on this woman's body and interfering with her rights. They're being fascists, basically. Notice that I've described both sides of this issue without bringing up God, because it's not a factor. People think it is, but it's not. I'm on the pro-life side of this debate, and I'm an atheist. Some people may use religion to answer the question, is a fetus a baby? Or even, whose rights come first, baby or mother? But you can answer them perfectly fine without religion. In reality, both pro-choice and pro-life arguments are deeply libertarian. One is defending the rights of the woman, the other is defending the rights of the baby. They can also be seen as authoritarian by their opposition. Pro-abortion lobbies use claims of sexism as an excuse to close off discussion and petition governments to protect the decision from discrimination, meaning that those who have a moral objection can't retaliate, even passively, to what they believe is the murder of babies. Likewise, the anti-abortion lobby actively wants to prevent an action by law, which is by definition an authoritarian stance, because they want to ban something, that being abortion. So which is the right-wing position and which is the left-wing position? There isn't one, but we all know that's bullshit. Pro-choice is the left-wing stance and pro-life is the right-wing stance. But how? It actually all comes down to sex, but we'll come to that in a moment. Part 4. It's as if politics is just more complicated than a binary decision. The abortion issue is only one of many issues that break this system. Ultimately, you need to accept that left and right don't really mean anything. All the key issues that matter to people are different, and the left-wing and right-wing base disagree based not just on a simple binary of collectivism versus individualism. They instead take each issue one at a time and consider them all, or at least they should. Some of the biggest issues are easily categorised, and we can take a look at some of them now. But when we take a look at them, you'll notice that they tend to lead into each other and influence each other. So, environmentalism. This is generally a left-wing concern, isn't it? The environment is important to everyone, but left-wing people tend to see it as a collective responsibility, while right-wing people see the regulations put in place as restrictions on their personal liberties. It's rare to see an environmentalist who's right-wing or a left-winger who's against environmental policies. They're at most neutral. This is a fairly easy one. If you're pro-environmentalism, you're more left-wing on this issue, surely. However, you are now also by definition a conservative, at least on this issue. Conservatism is the ideology of protecting and conserving the world as it currently is. It's a protectionist mindset. The concept is simple. Life is good, I like what I have, and I want to keep it as it is. This includes the environment for most conservatives. Suddenly this issue is more complicated, because most conservatives are right-wing. Okay, so next issue. Gay rights. This is clearly a left-wing thing, right? It has to be. After all those far-right homophobes hate the gays, don't they? No, they don't. Gay rights have almost nothing to do with the left-right dynamic, actually, and almost everything to do with religion. Extreme sects of every major religion are opposed to gay rights, with Christian churches like the Westboro Baptists being one of the most well-known, but it's not the only one, and it's not a Christian ideal specifically. Orthodox Jews are also anti-gay, and pretty much every sect of Islam is militantly anti-gay. And as a voting bloc, Muslims vote more than 80% in favour of left-wing parties across Europe. So that tells you something there. Interestingly, gay relationships also face intolerance and legal issues in Russia, China and much of Southeast Asia, where the prevailing governments are extremely collectivist, being both socialist and authoritarian. Conversely, the Western world, which is far more individualist in its laws and with more civil liberties, financial freedoms and individual rights, are also more accepting of gay people. But that should be obvious, surely. Gay rights are a civil liberty, so that's an individualist ideal. How does this all fit together? It honestly doesn't. It doesn't make sense. Right-wing groups in the West have historically been anti-gay for no good reason, often using their religion only as a justification, while left-wing groups, on the other hand, have historically championed gay rights in the West, while internationally the left has always been anti-gay, though the reason why isn't always clear. One interesting change is that the left have taken sexual permissiveness to a whole other level, and this is where it comes back to abortion. Sexual liberation. This is one that completely turns the left-right dynamic around. Sexual liberation should be a right-wing ideal, right? It's the personal freedom to do what you want sexually. So why is it that the left pushes for this and the right shies away from it? Well, it's the conservative mindset again. Conservatism is not right-wing. It's about preserving your lifestyle, whether that's right or left-wing. Sexual liberation threatens to undermine the family unit, established gender roles, and the moral meaning behind sex for many people. This is a radical change in society that people who want to keep their happy lives going the way they are don't want to have to put up with. The opposite side of this is the progressivist mindset, who believe that we are in a constant transition stage and the politics is always progressing and improving. These people are not interested in preserving the status quo because they see no value in it. They're usually younger, they have nothing really invested in the system, they tend not to have any real wealth, and they're usually not settled down or raising any family. For them, changing the system is an exciting prospect that may well benefit them, as they can explore more freedoms without limitations, an extremely individualist, libertarian, even right-wing perspective. However, for the conservative, who has invested time, energy and effort into this system, they have acquired wealth and have a family to leave it to, they're going to oppose the progressivism because it seeks to destroy and undervalue the things they built up. Sexual liberation may seem like a simple issue, but it's not. It's a fundamentally right-wing belief, taken to an almost cult-like following by a mainly left-wing progressive system, because they see it as an exploration of their rights, while the mainly right-wing conservatives see it as a threat to their way of life and the value of what they've spent their time building up. That's their family unit, their wealth, their lifestyle. These will all be made lesser by it. What makes things confusing is that the progressives take this right-wing ideal and then insert it into left-wing thinking, and it really doesn't fit. Collective identity. The collectivist considers the collective before the person. That is their whole worldview. That's the basis for communism and, to a lesser extent, socialism. It can be used for great benefit, with ideals like universal healthcare and systems of welfare being used as a way to ensure all people have a baseline sense of dignity in their lives. It can also be used very negatively, though, as a collective is a very powerful way to exclude. Rarely in any political system is the collective simply all people. It's usually all people of a certain identifier, which creates many recognisable issues. Nationalism is the collective identity of everyone within your nation, a left-wing perspective, and the other side of the National Socialism that makes up the Nazis. You don't need me to explain how badly that goes. We'll move on. Religious groups can use collective identity to keep people within their faith group, and racial identity is sadly all too often used to spark tensions for the truly ridiculous and irrelevant difference that is skin colour. Then there's sexual identity, which over the last 10 years has been a total circus, first with the feminist ideology and now the gender-denying trans lobby, turning the whole thing into a massive victim complex. Collective identity is a left-wing ideal that I personally hold to quite strongly at times. I believe that we're all better off when we cooperate. I'm a big supporter of things like universal healthcare and even universal basic income, which I believe can be very effective if done properly, but that's a whole other issue. These are the basic elements of socialism. The idea that we can strengthen society and allow all of society to rise because a high tide raises all ships. When it comes to identity labels that are unimportant, however, I refuse to acknowledge this kind of thinking. Rather than considering, for example, every black person individually to be an individual person, the collectivist mindset considers all black people to be a single entity. Any bad thing that happens to any one black person has therefore happened to all of them, which is why to this day a black person will have been trained by society to find the word nigger supremely offensive, yet they would have no personal reaction to the term Paki. On the converse, if you describe someone from India or Bangladesh as a Paki in the UK, yes, the term means anyone from Central Asia, not just Pakistan, that's one of the reasons it's so offensive, they would react, understandably, with great offence. It's highly unlikely that same Indian would react to the term wetback, though, a term used in parts of USA to refer to Mexicans and Latin Americans. Why do we react worse when the term used is connected to our own skin colour, when realistically we should find all of these terms of racism equally disgusting? It's because of collective identity. It's because the collective sees the things that affect any one group as affecting all members of that group. So, if you're black, you are trained to see any effect that affected any black people any time throughout history as affecting all black people, including you, when it simply isn't true. If you're a black American and you're offended by the American slave trade, but your family was actually from the Bahamas, you share as much history with the black slaves that you're empathising with as you do almost any other persecuted group on the planet. But skin colour has forced you to empathise and internalise their trauma as your own. It's not yours. You were not the slave. You were not abused. Nothing happened to you. As you can see, this is where I fail to see both sides, because I am an individualist to the core on this issue. Every person is a person in their own right. That's it. I don't care about your race, your gender, or anything else for that matter. You have value as a person, and every person is valued differently depending on who they are as a person. That is the right-wing response. That is the individualist response, and you would expect a group that pushes for gay rights and sexual liberation to be hyper-focused on individualism in this regard, but they're not. The progressives see you as part of a group, part of a collective. They see your skin colour, and now you represent every single person who has that skin colour, and everyone else who has that skin colour represents you. They see your gender, and now you represent all other people of your gender, and all people of your gender now represent you. This is why they had to disassociate gender and create this cartoonish idea of transgenderism, because the same ideology also preached feminism, which means they can't accept men or masculinity as a good thing because that's the patriarchy. This is why so many left-wing men are now wearing wigs and wearing dresses, pretending to be female or some vaguely defined pseudo-gender, because it's the only way they can function. They're collectivists, so either they have to represent men and be responsible for the actions of all men, or they must find a way to leave the group and no longer be considered men. Collectivist thinking is becoming more and more metaphysical. Every group you're a member of defines you, and every single member of that group is your responsibility. The Postmodern Collectivist. For a little context, you should understand what is meant when I say postmodern. Again, like most of the points here, this is extremely reductive and cut back because it has to be, or would be here all week. Modernism, politically and broadly speaking, was an attempt to move past traditionalism. Traditionalism was naturally rooted in traditions and ideas of practical realism, so modernism aimed to challenge those. Examples include in art questions like, does art need to represent something to be valuable? And does art need to be skillfully made to be of value? This same thing happened in politics. But rather than questioning traditions, it was questioning established reality and our perceptions. The problem with modernism was, it was all bollocks. The answer was an emphatic yes on all counts. Yes, art does need to be skillfully made, and it does need to represent something to have value, and the pompous prick in the turtleneck, claiming that the splotch of paint on a canvas is meaningful, isn't fooling anyone except a few rich twats who want to pretend they get it so that they can look down on others and feel smart around all the people who don't get it. In actual fact, there is nothing to get. The real smart people are the ones who stand up and shout, "This is all pretentious bollocks." Postmodernists disagree with me on this. They believe that modernism destroyed the idea of objective reality, and now the postmodernist world is one where all things are subjective, where morality, philosophy, and even science is subjective. They are wrong and they're fucking idiots. And no, I won't even pretend to be unbiased here. These people are insane. There's no such thing as your personal truth. No, I do not care about your lived experience. No, your perspective doesn't make a goddamn difference. Reality is what it is. You are irrelevant to it. It was here before you. It will still be here when you're long dead and forgotten. Put your fucking ego away. So, now that we've got that out of the way, what is the postmodern collectivist? Well, they're exactly what you think they are. They're collectivists who literally redefine the terms of the collective on an almost daily basis based on postmodernist-inspired subjective criteria, which means they believe gender is fluid, identity is fluid, sexuality is fluid. These three things often even mean the same thing to some of them. And again, it's highly linked to sexual liberation because they took an extreme right-wing ideal and crowbarred it into left-wing thinking. The only way to make individualist sexual expression work in a collectivist mindset was to deny the reality of the group divides, then declare all of the various disparate groups to be one interwoven, constantly changing subjective group identity, which they call the LGBTQIA+ group, with every letter representing a different sex-based identity and a plus sign for every other potential letter they might add, because they're going to keep adding more and more for every identity they invent. So that's gender, sexuality, and even just outright confusion over who you want to have play with your cock and how covered. But this identity was going to be further expanded to include people with various mental illnesses and basically every non-white race following the death of George Floyd. This created the racial pride intersectionality movement, which literally includes every single person on the planet with the exception of able-bodied, gender realist straight white men. The level of ridiculous mental gymnastics required for this belief system is mind-blowing, and yet it's becoming not just a mainstream position, but a collectivist religious cult. With the postmodernist rejection of major aspects of society, the majority of this new progressive group also reject religion. This doesn't mean that they're rational skeptics, or even just atheists, just that they reject religion in its organised form. They often believe in seemingly random supernatural nonsense, from star signs to crystal healing to homeopathy and many, many more. But vitally, their beliefs have no structure and no hierarchy. This allows for the collectivist mindset of old to be set over the top of this belief structure. The return of deep red communism, Marxism, in the West, marks the completion of what I call the extreme left. These extremist collectivists take the fiscal ideas of Marxism and bend them into their postmodernist mindset, and then they try to enforce both their Marxist adopted beliefs and their postmodernist identity nonsense through authoritarian measures, because that's how collectivists think. All opposition to the collective is forbidden, all must conform. Additionally, because these people have a postmodernist view permeating everything, their idea of morality is fluid and constantly reactionary. What is acceptable 2 years ago is now a moral crime. What is acceptable today will not be by 2023. Personal liberties, outside of those opposed by conservative ideals, which the left will adopt, are not respected. You go against the authority and you're punished. Free speech, free expression, free association, these are all done with. This mindset even goes far into explaining the politicising of the COVID pandemic. The lockdowns are issued by authority, therefore they are not to be questioned. The masks must be worn because an authority figure said so. The vaccines must be taken because the authority figure said so. Any questioning of the authority is wrongthink, and any questioning of the science has to be by the scientifically illiterate far right, or so they claim, while they also deny the scientific reality of fucking gender. But even beyond that, lockdown is good. Lockdown is social control. It's handing over more authority to the higher authority, which is good. It's limiting civil liberties, which is good. It's limiting the movement of people, which is good, unless they're immigrants, because identity and oppression and subjective standards based on skin colour, and let's tie ourselves in knots even further. But social control is good. The othering of those outside the woke progressive cult makes it so that now everyone is evil to them. All people are seen as far right, which they define as white supremacy or Nazism, despite Nazis being clearly left-wing, but it doesn't really matter because they define everything as white supremacy, including a black guy running for political office in California and a gay Jewish pundit married to a black man, both clear signs of white supremacy, am I right? This is where this insanity has led us. You can now see the progression of what has led to what I call the left. A postmodernist, Marxist, collectivist, sexual liberation cult that has somehow managed to push its way into the mainstream. Part 5. What about the other side? Well, the other side is literally everyone else. The thing is, people don't realise that they're the other side. The postmodernist Marxist collectivist group, this progressivist group, they only represent about 15 to 20% of the population, but they're so loud and they're so quick to strike at anyone who speaks out that people who are on the left of normal tend to stay quiet because they fear being cancelled by the left. You end up with this loud extremist faction ruling over a substantial amount of normal people because they're afraid of the consequences. But the other side is literally everyone else. The conservatives, the Republicans, the classical liberals, the libertarians, and yes, even the socialists. We're all in this together, honestly, and that's something that people really need to realise. Yes, the left has gone insane, and it's been infiltrated at every level in USA, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the vast majority of mainland Europe, especially within the EU. But that doesn't mean that there isn't still a left-wing collectivist stance that you can take and a right-wing individualist stance that you can take. I'm very much a centrist, and I describe myself as both a socialist and a libertarian. You can be both left-wing and right-wing without having to be insane. I support right-wing ideals when it comes to civil liberties. I am in favour of free speech, personal privacy, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, the decriminalisation of drugs, the right to own guns, gay rights, consumer rights, and the depowering of copyright laws. I support left-wing ideals when it comes to fiscal policies. I'm in favour of government-run, non-profit universal healthcare, prisons, schools, mass transit, infrastructure and energy. I'm in favour of a compounded tiered tax system and a cap on earnings, and I support the use of universal basic income in order to maintain a basic standard of living for all. On legal and civic issues, I'm largely centrist. I don't believe in a large government or a small government. I want an adequate government. I believe that we should have a reasonably sized police force, fire brigade, and a system of internal protections and procedures, but I don't want them to have too much power and control. I do want regulations on some areas. I want regulations on medicine and I want regulations on food, because I believe that people shouldn't need to be educated in those areas in order to be able to buy safely. I'm happy with a democratic system for deciding my laws, but I'm of the opinion that perhaps a civics test before being allowed to vote could work and would prevent people who think 5G towers caused the coronavirus from being allowed to vote on important issues of foreign and domestic policy, because frankly, those morons having the vote scared the shit out of me. That said, I'm also aware that such a system would be ripe for abuse, so I'm not sure how it would work or how to implement it. That's where I stand. There are other issues I care about as well. I'm generally pro-life and I'm pro-environmentalism. which are two opinions that tend to contradict, as one tends to go very left and one tends to go very right. But these are issues, not teams. But what do all these terms mean? What does conservative, Republican, liberal, etc. really mean? Well, a conservative wants to conserve their way of life. This is one we've already discussed. They want to protect the things they've invested time, money, effort and skill in acquiring and make sure that it lasts so that their family's life can be improved on. They're about motivated self-interest, but they're not heartless. They believe that if you work hard, you should be allowed to reap the benefits of what you've done. And as a fundamental belief, that makes sense. It's a meritocratic system of belief. It's one we've already discussed, and it's a common belief. And it's largely the reason that some collectivist ideals and some individualist ideals tend to cohabit. What about Republicans? Are they the same? Not quite. Republicans tend to be pure capitalists. They believe that the market can solve the issues of the day. They believe that the profit motive is an incentive to meet the needs of all people. If there are sick people, build a hospital and the sick will pay you to use your hospital. They get better, you get rich and everyone benefits. If there's a trend you notice and you create the next big gadget, then you sell your ideas to a person with a factory who makes and sells the item. You get a share because it's your idea. The factory owner gets the biggest share because they had to supply the factory and the resources and they therefore took the biggest risk. And the workers get paid for their labour, so they don't need to come up with ideas or take any risks. They can simply offer their labour and get paid for it, as is everyone's right to do. The consumer gets the item at a reasonable price and everyone is happy. This is capitalism fundamentally, and it's the core belief of most Republicans. It is the Republican belief that capitalism allows all people a chance to win, that anyone can come up with an idea and try it, making it a great equaliser among society. This was in contrast to what came before republicanism, which was feudalism. Republicans came about as a reaction to feudalism and monarchies, where the lords and the royalty simply had wealth because they were born into it. They believed that the royalty and the lords never earned their positions, so to protect this capitalist endeavour and to start something better, the Republicans forced revolutions across Europe, mainly in France. And they were also Democrats. Yes, USA, your two political parties' names mean the same thing. They believed in a representative democracy whose job was to maintain the infrastructure and rule of law and ensure that the markets remained free so that people could rise to the top through meritocratic means. That's the Republican belief model. So, what about the classical liberals? Well, they're similar to the Republicans in a lot of ways. They still believe that capitalism is a great equaliser, but they see it as capable of great exploitation. So, whilst they want capitalism, they want a liberal amount of government oversight. This is where they clash with the Republicans. Classical liberals will usually want a food standards agency to make sure the food sold is what they say it is, medical boards to keep doctors accountable for the care they offer, education boards to ensure that schools teach the correct syllabus and don't brainwash children, so on and so forth. This is a classic left position, looking out for the good of the people compared to the Republicans who look out for the good of industry. Republicans will claim that the Liberals are holding back innovation, causing stagnation, and are wasteful on a national level, while the Liberals will claim that Republicans are ignoring inequality and allowing unfair practices in the name of profit. This is the classic left-right divide and the classic debate. This is a reasonable debate. Neither side is right or wrong, they just have a differing view on where the line is, what is acceptable in society. But what about the extremes? There's more extremes than this. Libertarians and socialists. They step a little bit further away from the centre. Libertarians are focused on protecting individual rights from the government, ensuring that rights like free speech, free expression, property rights and religious freedoms are preserved. Some libertarians will take this to mean that their right to property is being infringed by the very act of taxation, making them align with the Republicans a lot more. They often resent the government for having any involvement in their lives at all, but few are so extreme as to not see the benefits of taxation, even if begrudgingly so. Socialists, on the other hand, see taxation as a way of allowing the pooling of resources in order to achieve things we can't as individuals. They want to see some sectors, particularly healthcare and prisons, run as non-profit state-run entities, paid for by taxes and free to the citizenry because they feel the profit motive perverts their purpose, something I personally agree with. They're also usually in favour of profit sharing for workers, where employees of a company are offered shares in that company and therefore a share of the profits from that company, referred to as the means of production. This gives each worker a personal incentive to see the business succeed, as they get more money if the business does better. This system is usually one strict capitalists dislike, as it means giving up their property rather than paying a static wage, and it lowers the reward for taking a risk that the owner would have normally taken. They get a lot less in return, so they're going to make much safer bets. But it's not completely at odds with capitalism, despite what many would have you believe. Ultimately, it's my belief that conservatives, Republicans, liberals, libertarians and socialists can all live together and coexist. We may disagree on a few issues, we may have a few policy decisions that we would rather have passed, we may think that some things are fairer than others, but ultimately we want to have a working society. We accept reality for what it is. What I see as the biggest issue in politics today, though, is the rise of progressivism, the postmodernist, woke Marxist movement that serves to define and divide us, set us at each other's throats and ultimately control us. Feudalism is dead in the West. White supremacy is dead in the West. Nazism and other forms of fascism are dead in the West. Let's not allow a new brand of Marxism to take their place. What does the left wing even mean? Well, right now, as of recording this, it means the biggest threat to Western civilization since the Third Reich. But it really doesn't have to. This is why I'm so political. As an old school lefty, I want my political position back. Thanks for watching.